session. We ask you to remain muted until question and answers. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Ron Byrne, who will introduce our presentation for today.
Good morning, everyone. Our speaker today is Hawley. Haven is chair of the Special Collections Department at the Smathers Library at UF. She got her BA from Baylor and a PhD from Georgia Tech, one of the premier technical universities in the country. Her thesis was on the subject of history and sociology of technology and science, kind of delving into human backgrounds of technology advances. Then came 9 years of career building, primarily at the University of Minnesota, where she also was very prolific in research and publishing on a variety of subjects. I think research is in Haven's DNA. All this brought her to UF in 2014 as chair of the Special Collections Department, post, of course, that she continues to hold today. Haven is the person at the library who really organized this entire course, lined up all of our speakers. So to have her here presenting herself today is very special. One of the things I most enjoy about these special collections courses is that once in a while, they bring us, maybe more often than not, they bring us something that's completely new to us. And I think that's what we're in store for today with Haven's presentation on the new trail. So Haven, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. That's a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate being able to talk with you today. I've been doing some research for a while, off and on a couple of volumes that are held by the Baldwin Library of Historical Children's Literature. The New Trail is a yearbook from the Phoenix Indian School. And I have to tell you, I'm not an expert. I'm trying to delve into this area because I'm really interested in how communities talk about themselves and create a common identity through the publications that they produce and that they try to communicate about themselves to others through. And so the New Trail seems to be a wonderful example of this. I'm also trying to do research in this area because I need to educate myself about Indigenous identities. And so while I may be a technical expert, I need to tell you that I'm coming to you today as a learner in terms of Native American history. I may be an Americanist, generally speaking, for much of my research. I've taught early American history, but I need to learn more. And I'm very glad that you're with me today as I tell you about some of the work that I've been doing. And in this talk, I'm shifting away from technical, which is usually what I do, to look a little bit more at the social systems that are related to these publications and how access to the technology, which is a continuing concern of mine, relates to community identity formation. So as I'm looking at the New Trail, it is a youth publication. And from my perspective, it really embodies a very complex relationship of Native American identity and children's education in the United States. So it's a perfect example of the Baldwin Library of Historical Children's Literature, which is primarily known as Anglo-American children's literature, but you can find a wealth of types of children's literature in the Baldwin Library. And we welcome you to do research or to study it with us. The New Trail was issued in 1941 as a high school yearbook of the Phoenix Indian School. And it was also reprinted as a revised, enlarged version in 1953 due to its popularity. I actually have, as a collector myself, also been collecting copies. The 1941 yearbook is very difficult to find, and it is in much poorer condition. The only copy I've been able to find for my own personal collection is not in terribly good shape. The 1953 copies were printed I think about 5,000 copies of them were printed and were sent out around the United States as part of helping to spread information about Native American identities and cultures. So you can get a copy of that much more readily. And I actually have several copies in my own personal collection, which I use for teaching. Now that is after I had seen it in the Baldwin. I became fascinated with this publication. I also have a number of items for Navajo education in my personal collection, and all this was inspired by what I saw in the Baldwin. In my talk today, what I'd really like to look at are basically three things. One area is what has education meant in terms of tribal US government relations. In reality, there are promises, and then there is what actually happens. I'm also very interested in how education can suppress and also express tribal identity. And then following up on that at the end, I'll talk a little bit with you about what agency means. Audre Lorde famously said that you will not disassemble the master's house with the master's tools, and that's quite a paraphrase. At the same time, we find that all of us live lives of compromise. We're always interacting with others who have perhaps more power than us in certain instances, and perhaps we have more power than other people do in certain instances. What does agency, or the ability to determine your future, to make choices that have an impact on your life and that make it possible for you to be self-directed, what does that mean when you're in the midst of these fraught power relations? And there are few power relations more fraught than those of Native tribes and the US government, and I would say also US society at large. It's a very complex relationship, and where we can look at the educational and the technical and the social resources and how those relate to how communities communicate about themselves. That's the topic really of today's talk. Let me make sure that I can. All right. So here we see copies of the New Trail, and I'm going to point out something to you which we'll look at in more detail later. These are two copies, 1941 and 1953. And if you look carefully, you'll be able to see that the 1941 copy is one in poorer condition, as I mentioned, and it also has fewer color segments of the paper. I want you to just keep that in mind, and we'll be talking about that at the end of the talk. You'll see this image again, but I wanted to have you think about that, because the takeaway is each of these colors represents a tribe and a tribal identity. We see a material manifestation of tribal identity in the New Trail, and that is perhaps the best nutshell of my talk today. So as I look at the first area of the talk, I'd like to just give a very brief overview of the history of US tribal relations, a very, very cursory overview. If you look at the various stages of Native and governmental, national federal governmental, you can see this goes into just the founding of the United States. Indian education is part of the relationship, and it was an expression of what is the responsibility of the US federal government to Native tribes who had given up some of their land, which was very highly sought by the US government. So when you look at the history of US tribal relations, we have to look at that as an example of negotiation and force. And over the many areas of contact, whether you're looking at Indian wars or treaties, each of them is a way that the power relationship was being negotiated. It's important to remember that many tribes are legally sovereign nations. And that has a special status, because what does that mean in relationship to the United States? Do we come at this relationship as equals? What we can see is that in practice, it means that there's a shaping and a testing and contestation of the relationship within Native communities, because tribes are quite different. And even within a tribe, there are different power relations. For instance, those who signed treaties with the United States federal government became leaders, certain tribal leaders. On the other hand, when we look at, for instance, Cherokee history, those who signed treaties with the United States government were enemies of many of the people who wanted to refuse to sign treaties with the U.S. government. So within tribes, we see that there's a negotiation. We see it across tribes, because tribes are completely not interchangeable. They are completely different communities. And while the white society may be saying Native American, it's very difficult to cluster tribes even in one large group. And that is something that is very problematic. We also see that there's really a three-way relationship. There are tensions among tribes, the federal government, and state governments. So we have a really complicated history as we're looking at what is the relationship of a tribe to education, which is a state prerogative, but yet it's taken over by the federal government. So in this slide, you see basically 4 different stages of where Indian education is being transformed. In the treaties stage, many tribal leaders signed agreements or treaties to give up land, because it was the land that the United States government wanted, and without very much of an option of signing a treaty. And so it's my understanding as I look at so much of this history that tribal leaders who felt they had no other options were trying to get something, anything, something that could benefit their peoples. And often that something was a promise for education from the federal government, that the federal government would ensure that there were educational resources, which was much more difficult to undertake in practice than it was on a piece of paper. As we look at the assimilation and allotment period, we are also looking at the relationship of tribes and individual Native Americans to the state as well as to the federal government. So we move from a period of tribal education that began around 1800, and that was primarily implemented through the federal responsibility for education would be by religious groups, generally speaking, but also through some governmental efforts. These were, to be very frank, intended to, from the white perspective, civilize Indians, to make them fit for white society. So you cannot get around the oppressive and assimilationist aspects. There was more than assimilation, however, during the early period. In many ways, education that was provided by the federal government or by religious organizations was to make Native Americans fit for white society by wiping out their Native identities, by not just translating identity to white society, but by creating a blank slate and then importing white native-born, perhaps, but not native cultures onto the tribes and the individuals. And when we look from around 1870s onward, the federal government pursued a policy of land allocation, and the land allotments furthered cultural assimilation. Native Americans were considered dependents of the federal government, and therefore they needed assistance to be able to assimilate into the majority culture and the economic structure. However, this process, as it was implemented, stripped many individuals of their larger identities, and it took away a key resource, which was tribal identity and being part of a community. These approaches for education and land allotment very much affected how community knowledge and identity were conveyed across generations. In the first area of education, in 1879, we find off-reservation federal Indian boarding schools were starting to separate Native children from their tribes and their families. This halted cultural transmission within the tribes, and the boarding schools have been more recently a subject of much more investigation as we understand the enormity of the tragedy. It has been known that this was devastating to communities, but now that we are seeing burial spaces for children in Canada, in the United States, that are associated with these boarding schools, it is so much clearer, and it's just an unavoidable image of that. Well, frankly, it forces us to really think, what is our responsibility? Can we completely separate ourselves from this past? And I hope that as we learn more about this past, we can see how to move forward into the future. So in that second area of land allocation, the Dawes Act of 1887 is a particularly important reform area. The Dawes Act, was part of a series of laws. It divided tribal lands, and it individualized land ownership. This is what I was talking about when I talked about economic assimilation, to be able to treat people as an individual, which then created a different relationship of that person to larger society. The individuals who accepted an allocation as their private property could become United States citizens, because Native Americans did not have an option other than this to become US citizens until the 1920s. So when they accepted this allocation, they also therefore separated themselves from community ownership of these lands. And that was part of breaking down many of the tribal relationships. The land not claimed by individual Native Americans was often sold to the public. So again, land is a crucial part of the relationship of Native tribes and the federal government. And the third area of assimilation, or this area of assimilation and allotment, is when we see the Phoenix Indian School being established. It was founded in 1891 on 160 acres of land that were provided for the educational benefit of Native Americans. That land was on the outskirts of Phoenix, and many of you who have been to Phoenix will probably know that the road systems in Phoenix specifically have gone around the reservation, except for a specific road that the tribe has allowed to go through. Like other Indian schools in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Phoenix Indian School, as it was early configured, was really a military style education. It had group housing, mandatory uniforms, highly regimented daily life activities. And the Phoenix Indian School was, it was actually called the Phoenix Indian Industrial Boarding School because it was the only non-reservation school in Arizona. And so you have to look at this school as a boarding school that had already physically separated children from their home communities and their families. They also separated children from their tribal languages, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And generally, federal Indian schools featured a unified curriculum. So there was one curriculum that was spread across many schools. And it did have higher academic standards than many of the schools that were maintained on reservations. But there was a serious social cost to that. The boarding schools prohibited tribal languages or participation in tribal customs while the students were in school and away from their homes. In this context, the Phoenix School was considered, it was innovative for acclimating newcomers by pairing them for the first 3 weeks with someone from their similar tribe. But after that introductory period, the Phoenix Indian School did revert to what was the standard practice of separating people who spoke the same language from one another. That made English the language through which these different individuals as students could communicate. It is hard for me to understand or appreciate the isolation that these children must have experienced. Boys and girls were also strictly segregated, and the vocational aspects were also part of something that are fairly well known, an outing system by which children in the schools were able to earn money by being sent out to families in Phoenix and mostly in Phoenix in order to learn vocational skills. That's a very mixed process because many children did not have a good experience. It was, I won't say a form of indentured servitude. It was, again, a power relationship that was very difficult for children to do anything other than to see themselves as being powerless. At the same time, it was a way of introducing children to larger society. And for some, exposure to that larger society provided certain opportunities, which they then parlayed into having native specific art studios. And Lloyd New, for instance, was one of those people. The outing system really was little more than cheap labor, and that has to be acknowledged. So when federal citizenship was available in 1924, and that's quite a long period of time that was not possible, it forced the states to accept Native Americans as state citizens, which then created a somewhat different relationship. It strengthened the option of local public education potentially. And yet at the same time, there's an irony because at that very year when Native Americans were allowed to become US citizens, you have highly restrictive immigration laws that are put into place. So there's this contest in larger society about who is going to be an American. This era of anti-immigration in the United States is that discussion of who is an American, and I'll talk very briefly about that with a concept of intercultural education, which was a form of progressive education that recognized there are differences across cultures and encourages people to share their cultures. Now, that clearly can relate to Native tribes. It also relates very much to immigrants, that there is among progressive educators in the early 20th century, a respect for different ethnic groups, and a desire to have education that shows the specificity of identity. This specificity of identity is not always as perhaps is not always respectful, and it can be very stereotypical. We find in Americans All, Immigrants All, an attempt to try to convey that there are different types of Americans through this national map of the continental United States. There are many more Blacks in the United States than what you see who are listed as Negro. There are more tribes than you see. I think there are only 2 tribes, probably Navajo and Sioux, because of the most commonly known tribes. But we do see at the same time an acknowledgement that there are multiple cultures within this nation, and this is a multicultural nation. Multiculturalism is not a melting pot. Melting pot is a very different concept. Multiculturalism has specific identities, and then we talk about those identities of what we have in common and what is different, and it has an expectation of mutual respect built into it. It was not uniformly adhered to or promoted, but progressive educators in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s did promote multiculturalism. So at the same time as you have this progressive education trend happening, and consistent with that trend, in 1928, the Merriam Report, which was a report that had the official title, The Problem of Indian Administration, was issued. The Merriam Report has been foundational in shifting concepts of what is the federal government's responsibility for Native education in terms of identity formation and its recognition of tribal cultures. This report, it looked at what is the effect of Indian education on each of the children. It was part of a review process that saw that education programs had been devastating to many Native tribes. Boarding schools were not socially or in terms of their facilities able to actually educate Native Americans in line with the treaties that had been established. And the report showed that, or at least asserted that, all of the non-reservation schools should be closed. However, we find that in 1931, the Phoenix Indian School started shifting from being a lower level to a high school. The concept was to have the smaller children, the younger children, be closer to their families. But the high schoolers, it was thought, would be able to better find contact with educational resources and vocational training. They could be more economically benefited by being able to have potentially sports teams so that they could then travel to see other people in the state and to have some contact. The report definitely supported this shift to progressive educational practices. And it basically said that formal education works best when it meets the Indian tradition needs and tribal identities. So we can see some similarities with intercultural education. And this is far more than just Native American education. This is a larger educational philosophy in the United States. So the Merriam Report specifically said that curriculum should turn back to tribe-specific topics, and it should match the student needs to the curriculum. This shifts you away from one uniform educational system to something that's going to assist all of the tribes to educate their own children. What that means, though, at the Phoenix Indian School, where you had multiple tribes attending, is that you inherently have to have some type of multicultural education, because you did not have a one tribe school. The Phoenix Indian School is a very large school. At one point, it was the second largest school district in the state of Florida, or excuse me, the state of Arizona. So although as a result of the Merriam report, attendance became voluntary, we do find that there was a pretty strong attendance that continued, because at the high school level, there was buy-in from enough of the tribes for the educational system in the Phoenix Indian School, and a recognition that it could benefit students more so than a school that was closer to home, the reservation schools. Another thing that we find among the progressive educators is that they very much like to document cultural practices. This is true among immigrants. It was true among the progressive educators who were working with Native American tribes. And we find that definitely is the background that helps us to better understand the new trail. So at this transition here, we're getting into the second quarter of the century. We find that there were impediments. While we have a printing shop here at the Phoenix Indian School from the 1920s, we think it's either 20s or 30s. I think it's actually more likely to be the 30s because of the type of equipment. At the same time, and because I have some knowledge of government printing equipment, and this would have been government printing equipment. It could have been late 1920s, possibly. This equipment would have been able to produce things that are 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17, or even a little bit larger on the press that's on the left-hand side. The platen presses are a fairly common type of press from the 1870s and 80s onward. A platen press, and what I mean by that are the men who are standing up, who have in front of a press that's quite vertical. That is what is known as a platen press, and they are, it looks like they have, some of them are power, some of them, or you see the belts up above are a power belt. So that would have been a press powered by the facilities plant. And the print shop was located near the facilities plant. In addition to having the technology, we also had the need for publications. The Navajo tribe was really a dominant tribe in the Southwest. However, very few Navajo attended the Phoenix Indian School. During the 1920s and 30s, there were linguists who were associated with the school and also associated with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they worked to adapt Native tribes' languages to systems of orthography, so ways of writing them that would assist education about pronunciation and a common sense of how to pronounce and what is the right way for a written language to develop. It is a very difficult step when you have an oral language to make it into a written language. And with Navajo, the orthography efforts were particularly deep and rich. Many of you will have known about the code talkers of World War II. And while there is no direct connection between these educational efforts and code talking, the governmental knowledge of the Navajo language and the belief that it was an important language that should be preserved and communicated, and also importantly, that could be learned by non-natives as well. And the orthography was critical for that. I believe that had something to do with recognition of Navajo as a potential code language. I do not have research to support that, but that would be an area for my research to continue. So when we look at the print shops here in the 1940s, and this is 1946 actually, with a linotype on the right and a press, larger press. You can see it's a fairly larger format press on the left. These were the machines on which The Little Herder and other language publications were written. The Navajo culture publications, Little Herder, preceded the New Trail. They were in a variety of different formats, and many of them were, you can see on the left, a type of tough paper, saddle stitched with fairly common printing paper in the middle, with a good resistant type of paper. When that's what I mean by a tough paper. There is not a, it's a type of textured vellum or strong cover paper. You also find these publications bound in more traditional ways. You can see in the Little Herder, and on the left you see English versions. On the right you see the language version, which specifically will help people to understand what are the words that are relevant to be learning. I have found that there was, nothing is neutral. Language is never neutral. I have found that a number of the examples of things that the federal government wanted Navajo terms for dealt with agriculture, because they were specifically trying to encourage Navajo to be more land oriented and to start working with the government on farming and with government agricultural services. So that again is an area of the shaping of culture. All right, so we get to the New Trail, and the New Trail had a variety of different types of content. You can see very clearly this is perhaps a little bit less quality publication that is wonderful for student printing. Students printed on the machines that you saw above. They also drew the original artwork. The organization of the publication shows that you have multiple tribes. And here again, we shift from having a handful of tribes to even more tribes. And as we look at the contents of the publication, this from the 1953 version, it includes Navajo, and Navajo was given its own large area. It was added at the end, and that's why I call this revised and enlarged. Inside of the New Trail, you have poetry by the students, music that is transcribed into Western notational systems with English translations provided, but also with some type of selection based upon what the student thought should be known about their tribe. The workers who oversaw the students were also Native teachers themselves. And one of the most prominent was Lloyd New, who went on to form a Native American arts organization that is one of the more prominent Native groups. He was a designer, and you see some of his effect on clothing that was considered to be popular in the 1960s and 70s. He and other people in the Native, they're in the Native tribes, as they moved out into larger society, one aspect of Native culture that could readily be recognized and that was treasured by others was the jewelry and the clothing designs. And we see that many non-natives in the 1970s and 80s absorbed these styles. There's a question about whether that's cultural appropriation. Is it appreciation or is it cultural appropriation? Now, I did want to say about the new trail, it was reviewed very well at the time. It was considered to be the best publication of its type, expressing what Native cultures and education meant. The 1953 copy was sent out to libraries around the country. In fact, most of the copies that I have been able to purchase have a library stamp in them. They're in very good condition because they weren't used. And so it does raise the question of, should I have these? I feel like it's perfectly fine for me to collect the copies that were put out for library use. I'm less inclined to try to keep for myself copies that were owned by a Native family. And there's only one copy that I have, and I do have an intention of giving it to another cultural institution. That's typically what I do when I collect materials, is I will assemble some rare materials and then give it to an organization that I've negotiated with. All right, I just want to wrap up with a little bit of a question. Many of you have heard about zines, and zines, as they're popularly known, tend to have an identity as an oppositional publication. They are typically not for profit. They're produced by volunteer labor. They are community based. They tend to be non-capitalist and oppositional to larger culture. The New Trail was a government publication because it was produced in a high school that was run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the printing presses that the students worked on were government printing presses. The teachers they worked with were paid by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At the same time, the students were able to create documentation about their own cultures. And we find perhaps the most artificial aspect of the New Trail is not its production, but the fact that we have brought together so many different tribes in one publication as an anthology of each of those tribes. And I just have some thoughts about it. This idea of multiculturalism being both something that brings the tribes together and brings the students together, but also something that can suppress individual identity. I don't have a statement of where I go with that. I just want to acknowledge that the construction of identity is enormously complex, both for Native Americans within their tribes and across tribes, as well as when you're looking at larger American society, which itself is very many different types of societies and cultural groups. If there's one thing that I have learned in working with immigrant groups, and I've spent years working with immigrant groups, it's that there are fractures within every community, whether it's an immigrant group or a church community, anything, any community, there are fractures that are only seen by the people within that community. But when that community tries to talk to a community outside of itself, it will often provide a united front, and it will show itself as a cohesive whole. This is true both of the Baltic groups that I have worked with, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, and also with the Native American tribes that I've been studying. So as someone who's just looking in from the outside and who is also part of this dynamic, because I am from the outside, I am from the culture that has imposed ways of education on Native tribes. I see that cohesiveness, and I'm not deceived. I recognize that this yearbook is an instance, it's a snapshot in time. It's not a forever document, but it does show us a moment that traces back to Indian education and treaties, it goes through progressive education philosophy, and it even is a result of intertribal relationships that have been navigated formally and informally through what was a boarding school and then became a high school. I look forward to our conversation. I hope we have just a little bit more time to continue talking. Thank you very much.
Great. Can you unshare it, Haven, so we can?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That's a look at Native American culture in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. Are there any questions on Zoom or yes, one, colleague?
Pat Collier, go ahead, unmute.
Yeah.
There we go. You can hear me. Thank you very much. I noticed in Ron's introduction that you had spent time at the University of Minnesota. Could you comment on the educational opportunities available to the group of Indians, the large group of Indians we had there, if you please?
So University of Minnesota is a bit unlike University of Florida. The University of Minnesota is a system, and it has multiple campuses. The majority of Native Americans are at the Duluth campus. In fact, if the Duluth campus is the educational institution where virtually every Native American dentist in the United States comes from, Duluth. There also is a large Native American population, respectively, in the Twin Cities. The Ojibwe band, for instance, or excuse me, they're Ojibwe, and then there are different bands, and also are in the Twin Cities, as well as in the Twin Cities larger, as well as in specific areas like White Earth and Blue Earth. I do have a contact who was a teacher, a non-native person who was a teacher in one of the reservation schools. And I would say, just very generally speaking, it is quite a quite different system of education. The resources are significantly less once you get out of the Twin Cities. Yes, true, in the more rural areas, whether you're white or native, there are fewer resources, and the Twin Cities is highly resourced compared to the rest of the state. The reservations have fewer library resources in particular. And one of the educator groups, the Institute for Global Studies, used to do also indigenous educator resources to try to work with educators so that they could better use the resources of the University of Minnesota, which is, like University of Florida, a land grant institution with special responsibility for the entire state. The University of Minnesota libraries were originators of a very important project with Ojibwe educators at University of Minnesota and in other parts of the state, and particularly with the tribal people. Ojibwe language dictionary is available online, and it's a project that recorded the language for specific words so that you could then have open access to native pronunciation. And this has been become a critical resource in terms of spreading Ojibwe language, and also for the University of Minnesota, which is one of the institutions where native languages can be taught. Ojibwe is taught at University of Minnesota. Somali is as well. It's just, it has a very unusual, Minnesota is a very unusual place, and has actually proportionately a high refugee population, proportionately. So I would say the libraries at University of Minnesota have been a solid partner, and they understand that you need to have an institutional commitment to providing the infrastructure so that Native elders who are willing to contribute their expertise and their knowledge can make a choice of whether to partner with a large, primarily white institution. I don't think anything is a model, but I would say that's a pretty good example of a community partnership with a primarily white institution. And I consider it to be not the same as the Digital Library of the Caribbean here at University of Florida, but as distinctive as the Digital Library of the Caribbean. They're different types of digital infrastructure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm not an expert. I'm speaking from my understanding, which primarily is rooted in my work for the Immigration History Research Center, which is a immigration research center and archives that it collaborates with the libraries there.
Any other questions? Haven, I did have one coming back to the Phoenix School. Is there any data or any feel for what happened to these students? Did they go back to the tribes after they graduated, or were they assimilated into the greater white society? What would your feeling be about that?
Well, what I've been trying to do, and this echoes what I do with my technical analysis. The whole thing that I try to do is I try to make sure that we remember history that has not received enough attention to be carried forward, and uncovering historical information. I've been trying to dig up names of students and names of teachers, and doing research on ancestry and through other genealogical tools, as well as, Google search and online searches, quite frankly, looking at obituaries, trying to see what happened. It's anecdotal. I can't, I don't have demographics on it, but I find that some people went back to the reservation. Some people went out to larger society. If you were an artist and you wanted to make a living at it, you happen to, in the 1960s and 70s, you would have to shift off the reservation later in the I think it's around the 90s and early 2000s. After the school closed, you also see a burst of population in the Southwest, and tourism as well. So there are opportunities to collaborate for indirect sales of your goods if you are an artist. At the same time, it depends upon what kind of art you want to have. Some of the names continue to pop up, like Lloyd New. And others just disappear. What I need to do, and I haven't been able to do yet, is to go to the Heard Museum, which has an archives that's in Phoenix. I need to be able to go through some of their files. I have used in this presentation images from the Heard Museum that they're owned by the museum, and I need to very respectfully credit the Heard Museum and also the individuals who are in those photos. I'm doing what I can to make sure that they get as much attention as possible for some really incredible work under difficult positions or difficult situations.
Is the Heard Museum a private museum, or is it associated with one of the universities?
I forget. I'd have to look that up. I can't. I don't believe that it's. I believe that it's independent, but I would have to check.
Sounds like a good resource.
Well, they do have boxes. I'm just going to have to go through them because only a portion of what is, no archive puts everything online. And I would say in particular, when you're dealing with cultural heritage materials of a community whose culture has been reappropriated, oppressed, and intentionally destroyed, you really need to be respectful of the use and reuse of the images. And I try to do that in my own work. And I also am open to comments that other people have so that I can continually critique my own use of historical materials of other communities.
Haven, I don't see any other questions, but I want to echo what Ron started with, and that you were so instrumental in pulling the series together, and then of course taking on this presentation and all the research and time that you've put into it. We're so appreciative.
Absolutely.
Well,
Thank you so much, Haven.
thank you. Thank you. This is a special community, and some of the smartest people I know are at OCAMIC, and so it is the opportunity to engage with you is really a wonderful thing. So thank you very much.
Right. Great. Looking forward to next week. Ramona Carpenegro, who's curator of the Baldwin, which is the Baldwin Library is part of Special Collections, and the Baldwin itself is a story. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh,
Amy?
absolutely.
So
Baldwin is fantastic.
So Ramona will be with us next week, and she's going to be talking again. We're coming back to education, the early readers, and by readers I mean the little book, Watch Spot Jump, Watch Spot, the kinds of things that we saw when we were kids. She's going to give us a view of how those developed and how they were used in education. I think it should be fun. We hope to see you then. It'll be an hour well spent again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Haven.